Hello, this is Barry O'Carroll, back with you with part 4 of the Fingal Library's photography class. This will be a bit of a shorter video today because we've already covered some of the main topics in our previous 3 lessons, and if you haven't seen those yet, they cover exposure, they cover composition and light. They're quite detailed and they're all available on the Fingal Library's YouTube channel, and I'll provide the link to that in the description. Today we're going to talk about a concept in photography that I find particularly interesting. It's called the decisive moment. So we've already spoken about how composition can make a photograph interesting, and we've spoken about how light can make a photograph interesting. And this one covers more the subject matter. And the aim of today is maybe to get people to maybe slow down a little bit when they go out with their camera, and instead of just kind of taking lots and lots of photographs, slow down, look around, and wait for what is called the decisive moment to hit the shutter on the camera. And what I'm simply going to do is go through examples of photographs. Some of them you've seen already, some of them you haven't, but we're going to look at them specifically with this idea of the decisive moment in mind. Now, where does this idea come from? Well, there's a French photographer that some of you may have heard of. His name is Cartier Bresson, and he was a documentary photographer. Covered some very famous moments in French history, the end of the war, for example. This is probably one of his most famous photographs. It's of a man jumping over a puddle behind the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, and it's the example he always gave as of the decisive moment. He claims actually that he just stuck the camera through a hole in the wall and couldn't see what he was photographing. I don't know whether that's true or not, but you can see what's happened here is he has captured it at exactly the exact moment where the man has just leaped from this piece of wood here and the reflection is here in the water. So he's captured that decisive moment. Now, the decisive moment doesn't have to be anything particularly fancy. It doesn't have to be some grand moment. It could be something very, very simple. And I'm going to show you examples of that now in a few moments. So first up is one of probably my favourite photographs that I've ever taken, and we've seen it already, taken in Bruges in Belgium. And it was of this man crossing a bridge on a foggy morning, misty morning, and when I came to this location, I kind of knew that there was something there. The bridge was very pleasing, the background buildings were beautiful, so I thought I'm going to hang around here and see if I can get something a bit special. I could have just taken the photograph without the person on the bridge, but it just wouldn't have had the same impact. So I set up at a wall, a key wall, and I had to wait about 45 minutes for the right person to come along. Every so often someone would cross, maybe, but there'd be several people at once, or maybe a car would cross at the same time, or maybe the bike and person would simply look too modern for the scene, because I wanted to get that kind of timeless feel with this picture. So I waited, and after about 45 minutes I saw this gentleman coming along and heading towards the bridge, and I thought, this is the moment. And there was a car coming the other way. Thankfully, he got there first. And I took it exactly at the moment where he was just in front of this kind of white building here. That was a deliberate decision so that he'd stand out. And if you remember, the left to right rule that we looked at in composition is in play here. Also the rule of space. There's slightly more space in front of him than there is behind him. That came into play as well, and it was one of those rare shots. When I took it, I knew I'd gotten the shot I wanted. So the decisive moment was getting the right person here in the scene to add a point of interest and getting them at just the right moment. So we'll move on. Again, we're going to Paris now, Omri Cartier Bresson city, and this was taken on a bridge near Notre Dame, and again, the decisive moment here was I was crossing the bridge. doing a little bit of street photography. It was a cloudy day, as you can see, and again, I mentioned in the last video that cloudy days are perfect for street photography. And I saw this street musician who was playing kind of 50s style rock and roll music, but while he was playing, this couple started dancing nearby. So I just started taking photographs, and unlike the last one, this time I took a lot of different photographs and went through them, and this was the one that I liked the best. I used the drive mode on the camera, which is where you press the shutter button, hold it down, and it will just keep taking photographs one after the other. And this was the one that I think turned out the best. So, you know, you've that decisive moment, the musician is playing, the couple are just at this point of their dance, and there's this gentleman in the middle kind of doesn't seem to be paying attention to anything. So just an interesting street scene, and again a good example of the decisive moment. So moving on, this is a type of photography. I don't do as much of it anymore, but it's called textured photography, where I've taken a photograph and then overlaid a picture of old paper on it to give that kind of vintage painterly look, and it can work really well for certain types of pictures, certainly ones that have kind of a vintage feel to them. This is taken in a lovely little French village called Messac, and I was in this cafe here, the Bar Chez Gilles, and this gentleman here in white came along and parked this car, the Citroën 2CV, an iconic French car, right in front of the cafe, and unbeknownst to him, created the perfect French tableau, the perfect French scene for me. And I asked him, "Do you mind if I take a picture of your car?" And he kind of said, "Oh, that old thing." And so he said yes, and I managed to capture this quintessential French scene. So the decisive moment was quite lucky. This gentleman came, parked his car, and created this scene for me, and just by sheer luck I happened to be there to capture it. So sometimes the decisive moment can be down to good luck, and there's more examples of that later. Sometimes it's down to patience as well, as in the one with the cyclist. Also, the decisive moment may not be a thing or a person. It could be a moment of light. And I alluded to this in the last talk I gave on light as well. This is in the college chapel in Maynooth University. And for a brief moment, the sun shone through the windows here over to the left and created this beautiful effect on the far wall and the seats here. And that light only lasted a minute or so. So sometimes a moment of interesting light could be your decisive moment. This is a popular one that I took in the garden of a friend who lives in France, again down near the village you saw earlier. And this is a mother cat in a wooden box, and the box was up on a set of steps outside a house, and she had kittens in the box, and she was quite wary of me, but I decided to hang about because I said there's a potential for a shot here, and I waited maybe half an hour trying to coax her out, and she finally just popped her head up above the box, and I managed to get the photograph. So again, she was gone again a second later. And for those who did the first lesson, you'll notice that I used a shallow depth of field here to blur the background so that the sharpness of the cat really stands out. Again, street scenes are great for the decisive moment. This is one where, I mean, I could have taken this photograph without the people in it, and it would have been a pretty good photograph. But often adding a human interest can make the photo just that bit more interesting. And again, while I was setting up my tripod here, this couple just stood right in where the lamppost here and the column is here. And they actually had a blazing row. The poor guy was being berated, I think, but thankfully they stood still long enough for me to get the shot there. And then it finished with the most Italian scene I've ever seen in my life, whereas after the lady had finished berating the man, she then gave him a big kiss and sent him on his way. So it's possibly the most Italian scene I've ever witnessed. So back to light being a decisive moment. Again, you've seen this one before. It's taken in Tunisia, and it's a long exposure shot. But the sun is sitting on the horizon there. That moment lasted, a minute at most, not even, maybe even a few 30 seconds. And luckily I was there at that exact moment to capture that. And that's a moment, a decisive moment that will never be repeated in exactly the same way. So again, there was a lot of patience involved there. I set up the shot, and just waited for that moment. And I only had one really chance to get it because it was a long exposure. Seconds after I took the shot, the sun was gone. Again, returning to Venice, the Bridge of Sighs. And I mean, this is one where again I had to wait for the right moment for a gondolier to pass underneath and just be nicely into in the bottom left hand corner of the scene. Often this is a very crowded canal. There's often a lot of different gondolas and boats. So I waited until it was mostly clear and that there was just a single gondola passing through. So again, a bit of patience was required. Back to light again. You've seen this one already. Again in Venice, and again that pink light you see on the clouds lasted about a minute at most. And again, I was lucky that I was in position, ready to go, and when that lovely pink light began to develop, I was there ready to get the shot. Another bit of kind of documentary street photography, this time is still in Italy, in a small town called Cividale del Friuli, absolutely beautiful place in the north of Italy. And I was in a cafe with some Italian friends, and I just noticed this priest having a chat, and he had the big glass of wine there and having a smoke as he does. And I just thought he was an interesting character and an interesting scene. So I pretended to take a picture of my friend, and at the last second swung the camera around and got this candid shot. And it's just an interesting little kind of moment captured. So like I said, street photography, documentary photography. In fact, documentary photography, you see these great journalistic photographers and National Geographic photographers. It's all about the decisive moment. This was taken just off Grafton Street and Johnson's Court, and you can see there was a couple outside a jeweller shop, and they just stopped for a moment to have a look. And again, it was a long exposure, and you can see that by the people here that are blurred, but they stayed still just long enough for me to capture them. And they seem to be looking at engagement rings. The guy looked absolutely terrified, to be honest. But again, I was there to get the shot, and I waited, maybe half an hour for the right people to come into the scene. I think that jeweller is closed now, so that's a decisive moment that'll never be recaptured. This was an interesting one taken in Amsterdam. I've shown you in the first lesson when we spoke about long exposures and long shutter speeds, that you can be used to create traffic trails. Well, in this case, I created a traffic trail on the water, because obviously in Amsterdam it's mostly boats. And I set up in this location, and again, even without the traffic trails, the light trails here, it would still be an interesting scene. But I just think they make it even more interesting. Again, what happened here is, again, I had to wait quite a long time, because every so often a boat would come from this direction. It didn't look as good. Sometimes a boat came from here, but then would make an awkward turn and go under this arch. And it meant there was an awful squiggle of lines. And then eventually I spotted one boat coming at some speed, and it shot under the bridge and straight through. And again, I was there to capture that moment. It's a 30-second exposure. Something similar again on the Seine. This time it's one of the famous bateau mouche boats that kind of ply their trade up and down the Seine with tourists. This river can be quite crowded at times, and when I was here there was a lot of boats coming up and down, and I just wanted to wait for a moment where I got a single boat passing in front of the conciergerie here, which is a beautiful medieval building. And I think I mentioned already, it's where Marie Antoinette spent her last night, so well worth a visit. One of the lesser known places to visit in Paris. So again, I waited, and this boat came into the scene. Nice bright colours that contrasted well when I turned the photo into a black and white image. Again, the left to right rule is in play here, and the rule of space is also in play, that we learnt about in the composition lesson. This is another case of waiting for the decisive moment, taken in Tunisia again. This is the entrance into the souk, or the market area of the town of Hammamet. And again, I set up and just waited for the right person to come along. And, you know, luckily this gentleman came along pretty quickly. I've seen some photographers who set up a timer and put themselves into the photo, which is one way of doing it, I suppose. But this is maybe a little bit more authentic. And so just waited, and like I said, eventually the person came along. And again, you can see there's a few different compositional techniques at play. There's the patterns on the ground here. There's framing. The arch here frames the person. You know, the rule of thirds is at play as well. And I like the way the arrow kind of points towards the person in the scene. This was taken from the roof of the Montparnasse Tower in Paris, near Montparnasse railway station. And again, the decisive moment here involved light and this sunburst that happened. And I wasn't ready for this shot, and I kind of had to rush when I saw this happening outside to get my gear ready. And thankfully I managed to get the photograph. And it was just at that exact moment that the beams of the sunlight there just came through onto the city. Again, it was gone in a few seconds. Wildlife photographers are all about the decisive moment. It's not something I do a lot of, but this was one day in the Phoenix Park, and I was photographing these deer, and this was sheer luck. When I took the shot, this deer stopped and looked back. One of those rare occasions where I think a central composition works quite well, and it just added a little bit of interest to the scene. This was taken in Terraria in Portugal. Again, it's about light and weather conditions. This beautiful sky here, the kind of transition between dusk and blue hour, where you've got the deep blue of the sky but also the pink hues of the clouds. Again, I was set up in position for nearly an hour there, taking different photographs at different times and different lights. This particular bit of light lasted maybe a minute or so, and again I was there to capture it. So a lot of photography is waiting. I prefer to take a few really good photographs at the right moment, at the decisive moment, than taking a lot of mediocre photographs. I've mentioned David Naughton before, one of my favourite photographers, an English photographer from Dorset, I think, and his first book is called The Waiting for the Light. It's available in most libraries, and in the book he describes how much of his time is spent just waiting for that moment of good light to happen. And he describes that he once went to China and waited 10 days for the right light, and he came back with one good photograph. So I'm not suggesting you go to China and take one photograph, but do slow down, take your time, and wait for that moment to get that special photograph. This is taken in a lovely town in southwest France called Carle. It's a sepia photograph of the Pont Valentré, a medieval fortified bridge. And again, you can see the diagonal here, you can see this framing, and I just waited for the right moment for somebody to walk into the frame and in under the archway there to create a more interesting composition. I've showed you this before, again a couple watching an orchestra play outside the Café Quadri in Venice, and you can see the long exposure here has blurred the violinist here, makes him look like he has two heads, and the couple there are watching him. You've got the guy playing piano here, so it's just an interesting little moment that was captured, a moment that will never be exactly the same. Stephen's Green now, and again the Fusiliers arch, using the framing technique. And the frame kind of mirrors the shape of the dome here on the Stephen's Green Shopping Centre. And again, waited for the moment for people to walk through the arch. It's usually very crowded there, so it was actually hard to get a photograph with only a couple of people in. Again, Stephen's Green, so just a few metres away. A lovely early autumn morning when you've got that beautiful golden light coming through the trees, dappled light. It's a very warm image, and you've the leaves here. And I just like this moment, the contrast. You have the young guy here, I think he's reading a book, and then this gentleman here, he's just lit his pipe and the smoke is lifting up and he looks across. And again, it's just a moment in time that's been captured. I've shown you this already. Again, the two gentlemen having a walk in Maynooth University, just walking up and down there. This one they made it a little bit easier for me because they were walking up and down, so I had a few attempts to get this shot. Again, the shot would be okay without the minute, but it just adds that little bit of interest. This one again in a couple of kilometres away in Maynooth. This lovely bridge over the Rye Water, and again I just waited a few minutes. I saw the swan was kind of going up and down the river, and I thought maybe he'll come into the scene at the right moment, and he did eventually. And again, it creates a little bit of interest there. This is going back to Portugal, and again we're talking about a person. I love urban scenes like this, but just adding a bit of human interest really gives a sense of scale. And this was a lady who walked past me as I was taking the photograph, and actually asked me a couple of questions about the camera and that. And when she kind of got far enough, I took the photograph, and she kind of silhouetted against the building up here and the lights. And again, it just gives that sense of scale to the scene and a bit of human interest. And this was taken on the same day that I took the photographs of the deer in the Phoenix Park, and it's one of those examples of time I got lucky twice in the one day, that I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. These are the famous Phoenix Park tea rooms, and while I was setting up the shot, a couple came along and they said their goodbyes at the tea rooms and shared a kiss there, and I just happened to be there at that exact moment. They even stood right in front of the door to frame themselves for me. They were right in where the rule of thirds is. They couldn't have been more helpful to the photograph. So it was just, a nice example of sheer luck, of being in the right place at the right time. Again, another example from Temple Bar this time, of an early morning street scene, empty streets. And just a single person walking along to just add a bit of human interest and scale to the scene. And this is the final photograph. If some of you may recognise, there's a shop on the left there called Shakespeare Co. It's in the Latin Quarter of Paris. Shakespeare Co. is actually was the bookshop that published Ulysses by James Joyce. The shop was in a different location at that time. Now it's on the left bank, and it's quite close to Notre Dame, just facing Notre Dame Cathedral. And this here is a Wallace fountain. They were donated to Paris by an Englishman, actually, of the name Wallace, who wanted to give Parisians clean drinking water, and they're still dotted all around the city. It's actually a green colour, which you can't see here. But what was interesting in this shot was I set up and I waited a good 45 minutes to an hour for this. I just thought, if I could get the right combination of people here. And again, a lot of luck came into this, because this lady walked along right at the same moment this woman was walking into the shop. So you kind of have a zigzag of this statue looking down at this person who's walking towards this person who's walking into the shop. So, again, there was a lot of luck involved, but it's one that I really liked afterwards, because it just gave me something a little bit different, a little bit interesting from that scene. So I hope you found that interesting. And what I want you to do is, when you go out with your cameras, within your 2 kilometres, of course, or when this hopefully is all over, when you get to Rome a bit further, slow down. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. As I said, pick your moment to go out. Okay, look at the last lesson on light. Think about when the best light is going to be available. When is your best chance of getting the best light? If you find an interesting location, don't just immediately start taking photographs. Take a look at it. Think, right, what's the best composition here? Could something interesting, maybe somebody could walk into the scene to make it more interesting? Could the light change? If it's a wildlife scene, What could I wait until, an interesting moment? So that's the key. Slow down and wait for that decisive moment. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just something that makes the scene more interesting. So we'll leave it there, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Once again, I hope everyone is doing well and keeping up the social distancing, and hopefully we're flattening the curve, and as I keep saying, better times ahead. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the comments, whether it be on Facebook or on YouTube. And the Fingal Libraries has a new YouTube channel, so if you're watching it on that, make sure to subscribe and tell all your friends about it as well. There's lots of great story times on there, and craft videos and presentations, talks, discussions. It's a really fantastic resource. So goodbye for now, and we'll talk the next time.